session, and it's getting emotional in this session. And to spice it up even further and to make the presenter more excited, I have the honor to hand over an honorable mention award to you. So this. And here is your presentation recognizing emotional expression in game strings. The mic is off.
Hi everyone, I'm Shara Rufi from Aalto University, Finland. Today I'm presenting recognizing emotional expression in game strings. You know that we cannot separate emotions from games. Some study equates emotions with positive player experience, some others know emotion as key factors in defining fun. And also, we know that there is this public and underexplored resource of game history videos. We can see here an example of the game student videos. We can see that player how to show his emotion and even narrates his feelings. So we decided to investigate emotions inside game strings to see if we can detect the human annotated emotional events in those strings, and if we can identify the most intense events of game strings. We have contribution in this paper. We have presented a new set of emotional events in game string, which contains 17 videos around 2,000 emotional events. We also present a multimodal neural network for predicting, for detecting these emotional events automatically, which uses facial expression recognition, speech sentiment analysis, audio emotion analysis, and also audio features like loudness and pitch. For dataset, we use Unravel and Unravel 2 games, which are puzzle platformer games. We selected these games because they are recently released and there are multiple streams available for them. And also they have linear level design, so we expect that players experience game events in the same sequence. And both of them have been praised for being emotionally engaging. Our criteria for selection game string is that the face of a streamer should be visible throughout the video, a streamer should speak in English, and only one person was playing and present during the stream. Also, the automatic captioning is available for the game stream. This process resulted into 17 videos by 9 different streamers, 2 women and 7 men. Each video has been annotated by 2 annotators into 13 classes of emotions like happiness, amusement, startle. And also each emotional event has been labeled as being top 5 event or not top 5 event. We tried 4 types of classification. The first one uses no events and event class. The second one uses top 5 event and not top 5 events. The third one uses 4 classes of no event, pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral event. Pleasant event like happiness, amusement, and unpleasant event like startle, frustration. Neutral event like mood and wonder. The last one uses no event class and all 13 classes of emotions available in the dataset. As I told, each video has been annotated by 2 annotators, so we calculate their human agreement for each video, and as you can see, the human agreement decreases with more fine-grained classes. So, for example, you can see 14 classes is not very reliable, and with larger window lengths, because we use a time window that goes along the whole video for predicting this human agreement. And with larger window lengths, the human agreement increases, but we kind of lose temporal resolution. In our automatic detection system, we apply facial expression analysis on streamer face. We apply audio analysis on streamer voice, and also sentiment analysis on streamer's speech. All of these modules are trained on public large data set, which outputs the probability of different basic emotions or positivity of a speech. Output of these modules are time series signals. We combine these time series signals in a time window using a temporal neural network, which is trained on a smaller and custom data set. And this neural network outputs the probability of emotional event. Here you can see an example of our input signal. As I told, in a large time window, we kind of lose temporal resolution. So we can see that one annotator detected two events in this time window. Another thing is that you can see one annotator detected this event as startle and the other one detected it as surprise. Because surprise and startle have similar expressions, they are harder to be distinguished by humans. And here is an example of game stream alongside the input signals. Here you can see the results of our automatic emotional event detection. We use different combination of input signals. And the first column shows just using facial expression, second one facial expression and sentiment analysis, third one facial expression, sentiment analysis, and audio emotion analysis. Fourth one facial expression, speech, sentiment analysis, and audio features like loudness and pitch. The last one uses all input signals. Here again, like human agreement, the performance decreases with more fine-grained classes. And you can see that window lengths of one almost always produces the worst result, but we cannot see a significant difference between other window lengths. At least in our case, facial expression and audio features were the most informative signals, and facial expression, sentiment analysis, and audio features produces the best results here. But adding more input signals cannot help us every time. The reason maybe because of overfitting, since our dataset is fairly small. Unless the input signal is very informative, adding more input signal can lead to overfitting. And another thing that I want to mention is that our audio emotion analysis had good results on audio dataset. We can find more details on the paper about that. But the performance of it during applying on chemistry is reduced. And the reason is that because here, besides a streamer's voice, we have game audio and here you can see percentage of missing events within the best performance of two-class model. Our classification, as our system is mostly has good performance on detecting positive emotional expression, and some subtle emotions like mood, wonder, and puzzlement have high false negative, maybe because that they have lower intensity expression. And also high amount of false negative for negative emotions like frustration and startle, maybe because that they are immediately followed by a positive, immediate positive expressions like smiling. As future work, we want to add annotation of gameplay events as a complementary material. We want to investigate the effect of differences in gender, age, and culture on our system. And also we want to test our system on playtest videos without game audio. In summary, we presented a new data set of emotional events in game streams. We have presented an automated detection of emotional events in game stream using multimodal neural networks. And we show that identifying emotion is a hard task for both human and artificial neural networks, but with limited number of classes, we can get reliable results. We get, for example, in case of just detecting events, we get automatic detection accuracy of 70%, which is on par with human agreement of 68%. This suggests applications in video highlight detection and pre-screening videos for later analysis. Thank you.
Thank you. Very nice paper, nice analysis of the results. I like this progression from 2 class to 40 class results. I see the challenge. But I have a question basically about what's on here. Automatic detection accuracy of 70% compared to the human entering agreement. In the big table, we also saw 80% accuracy for like 2 class to window or 3 class to window.
Yeah.
Anyways, how do we interpret 70% accuracy in case of 86% human integrated reliability? Because that's not entirely evident to me what it means to have an accuracy of 70% now.
Actually, that's a good question. Thanks. That human agreements cannot completely, it's not completely comparable with automatic detection analysis. Since in case of human agreements, one person tries to predict another person, but here we kind of try to predict the average of annotation of layers. Because of that, they are not completely comparable.
The 70% seems to assume some kind of reference to a ground truth, but a 68% human integrated agreement kind of suggests you don't really have a ground truth. So shouldn't you need to do an extra layer of analysis taking the automatic detection back to humans and say how meaningful and recognizable is the outcome of my automatic classification afterwards for human assessors?
Yeah, actually that would be interesting to investigate. Yes.
Okay, so like
No, I mean,
suggestion for future work maybe. I don't know. It's not meant as a
Yes, hi, Answer Dumping Electronic Arts. Thank you so much for the talk. I'm really looking forward to reading this paper. Could you, I'm sure it's in the paper, but could you describe a little bit the setup and how you prompted your participants so that they emoted so strongly as they do in the videos?
You mean?
Oh, these are game streams
Yeah.
from, and then where did you get them? I hope you did.
YouTube.
Oh, okay.
All of them.
Well, in that case, don't you think there's a little bit of a performative aspect?
Yeah, sure. There is, I guess, we have this problem with game streams. They kind of exaggerate their feelings, but we can apply this method on video playtests that are more realistic. But even in case of game streams, it is good that they kind of narrate their feelings because they want to attract their viewers, and because of that, for example, we less in the gaming phase and this stuff. Because of that, yeah, I guess it's worth analyzing.
Thanks.
Hi, Wiesner from University of Utrecht. Maybe I've missed this, but did you train the classifier for each specific video feed source, or
No.
is it just the same classifier for all?
For
Thank you.
Okay, so let's thank Maria again. And we stay emotional with the next presentation and spice it up a bit. I have for this paper, so you didn't expect that. Now we hope that works. Luca is presenting a paper exploring emotional attachment to game characters. And we're almost there.
Thank you. So, hi, I'm Julia, and today I will talk about emotional attachment to game characters. In our lives, we form many different emotional attachment to various people and objects. For instance, I'm deeply attached to my parents, to my partner, to my cute cats, whom I also feel responsible for, as well as fictional characters from books and movies. For instance, yeah, I used to have a crush on Legolas from The Lord of the Rings. But what about game characters? The games industry is increasingly interested in designing emotionally engaging characters. Last year's GDC, for example, a designer at Square Enix described that one of the main design goals was to provide the players with an emotional character experience. In player experience research, we often discuss concepts such as, for instance, identification, which is the imagination of player being the character. Other works explore relatedness, which is the sense of belonging and feeling connected to others. And in last year's Play, a study talked about meaningful emotional relationship to game characters. However, we don't actually really know what exactly emotional attachment to game characters is, because these concepts do not explain what exactly is meant with meaningful emotional relationship, or do not explain what emotional experience players have when they are attached to different characters, game characters. But if we consider attachment in our lives, the emotional quality of the attachment to a partner, for instance, differs from that to a family, to pets, or to a fictional character from a movie. So, we set out to explore the emotional attachment to game characters. We conducted an online survey where 213 players described a character they really like. We included 8 open answer questions to explore what emotions players experience and whether there are different forms of emotional attachment. To find it out, we conducted inductive thematic analysis on our dataset. What did we find? We identified 7 different forms of emotional attachment, each characterized by different emotions. This is our final thematic map, which you can also find in our paper. Today, I will focus on 3 attachment forms more in detail. For the rest, please refer to our paper. The first theme we called cool and capable. In this theme, participants emphasized how empowering playing these characters felt. For instance, this participant explained that playing as Bayonetta made them feel badass, in control, powerful, and free to amuse themselves.
These characters were mainly player-controlled, and participants emphasized how effective they are in gameplay. So they, for instance, described character skills, the damage they deal, what weapons they use, or over-the-top movements. Another thing we identified was Admire Paragon. Similar to the previous theme, these characters were strong in gameplay too. However, what was unique about this attachment form was the emotional quality that players reported. Players professed admiration, awe, and amazement for these characters for perceived virtues they embodied. For instance, the same participant further explained that she admires Yuna from Final Fantasy X for her strength and kindness in any situation. Some players even considered these characters as their role models. As this quote illustrates, players looked up to these characters and aimed to emulate them in real life. The final theme I will talk about today is concern for one's protege. Different from the previous two themes, participants mainly mentioned non-playable characters. Participants described how they worry about these characters and try to look after them. For instance, when referring to Ellie from The Last of Us, this participant stated that he worried and he felt responsible and cared for her well-being. But importantly, even though these characters were more vulnerable than the player character, participants explicitly stated that they were not a burden. So they did not get into players' way, but rather they were supportive or sometimes even helped the player. What do we learn from these findings? Firstly, our findings show that identification matters only for some of the attachment forms, such as wanting to be more like the Admire Paragon. This suggests that the concept of identification might not always be relevant when analyzing game character attachment. Secondly, our data indicates that the relatedness to game characters comes with different flavors. So, while all participants reported a sense of relatedness, the emotional quality varied considerably. So, for instance, feeling empowered when playing as Bayonetta, or feeling worried for Ellie and caring for her well-being. As such, these insights enable a more nuanced evaluation of character attachment and may also inform game design to envision a specific emotional character experiences. And finally, our work also raises several new research questions about other types of possible emotional character attachment forms, which are worth exploring in future work. Thank you very much.
Sarah Wiseman, Goldsmiths, University of London. Did you have to help your participants to understand, how did you help your participants understand what emotional attachment meant? So, for example, the participant who reported on their feelings towards Bayonetta, I would not have ordinarily called that emotional attachment. I'm not saying it isn't, but I'm just wondering how your participants understood what you meant by emotional attachment, or whether they helped you understand it.
So we actually asked, we phrased the question as to report about a character they really like or really liked in the past. So we didn't directly ask participants about emotional attachment they have with characters. So these participants, we also asked 8 questions, and for instance, they first described what or the overall description of the character they really liked, why they really liked them. We also asked about what they feel about these characters, and some other questions. And from all these data, we identified these 7 attachment forms.
Hiya, Jo Yacovides from the University of York in the UK. Thank you for that, it's really interesting. I was just wondering, were there characters that just kept coming up that people, I'm just wondering if you could say if that did happen, and if it did, what do you think that means for emotional attachment?
Do you mean characters that were frequently mentioned?
Like,
Okay.
was Bayonetta mentioned once, or was Bayonetta mentioned like several times? So that's...
Yeah, there were characters that were mentioned several times, of course, and we also found some patterns, kind of. For instance, Ellie, or Clementine also. These kind of characters were only mentioned in within the Concern for One's Protege theme, and so. I prepared some other slides. So yeah, for instance, these were typical for Concern for One's Protege, or characters like Aloy or Link, which were more typical for Paragon. But yeah.
Just a quick follow-up if I may. Just, were there any that it was the same character but very different forms of emotional attachment, or was it relatively similar patterns?
Not sure if I understood the question well, but so okay, they were mentioned across different. Yeah, okay. Yes, there were also such characters. Link was one of them. I put as a typical character of Admire Paragon here, but he was also mentioned in Cool and Capable theme, or some other themes too. Yeah.
Hi, Regan Magic, University of Saskatchewan. People often, researchers often talk about there being a nice tension between being able to exert agency through a character and in narrative-based games in particular, feeling empathy for a character, and sometimes those two things can't really coexist very well. And I'm wondering if in your study, if people were looking through either of those lenses, or if you found kind of a mashup, or was it really primarily like an agentic view of character attachment?
That's a good question. We didn't specifically look into that, but so agency wasn't really mentioned in our data, but empathy was something that was very central for the sympathetic alter ego on the far right side. For this theme, it was very central. For the others, it was mentioned sometimes, but not as much as that's been.
Okay, maybe last question. I would have one, which is maybe a good handover to the next talk. You asked people how they like characters and it's sort of positive attachment. How about the negative ones? Also, couldn't it be fun to play like a real bastard? So where you sort of hate that character?
That's an interesting question. So first, we didn't ask. So we asked about a character they really like. So we didn't see a character they hated or didn't like them, I should say. But there were characters that were kind of their nemesis. So villains in the game. But participants also liked these characters, even though they, sometimes feared them. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Give her a hand again. And again, congratulations for the and I could do that further question because we have the laptop set up already. We have 2 presentations on 1 laptop. And I particularly like the title of the next one, Horror, Guilt and Shame, Uncomfortable Experience in Game Design.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Jo Iacovidis, and I'm presenting some work that a master's student of mine carried out last year, looking at uncomfortable experiences in digital games. So there's been some previous work looking at negative emotions in gameplay. So there's been work on emotional challenge, so how games don't just kind of challenge us in terms of difficulty, but in terms of the emotional kind of dilemmas they give us. Emotionally moving moments, so this tends to be a sort of mix of positive and negative experience, kind of sad but good kind of thing, and that's been done by some people in this room as well, including Julia who just spoke to us. There's also been some interest from live action role-playing games in that mix between positive and negative experience and how it kind of comes together in particular scenarios. And some interest in forms of positive discomfort in games such as Spec Ops: The Line that play with player expectations. But generally speaking, this work sort of suggests that negative emotions are definitely something that is a common part of gameplay, but they often focus on this mix of the negative and the positive. So what we wanted to do was look more explicitly at negative forms of emotion in terms of discomfort. So how does discomfort actually manifest in games? So primarily negative experiences, and what does that discomfort do to overall engagement? So what we did is we carried out an online survey. There were some clear kind of ethical considerations here where we realised we wanted to talk to people about their uncomfortable experiences, but we wanted to minimise any potential harm coming to our participants and also on the researcher side. So Chad did some work, some desk research and some looking at reviews to narrow down to a set of games that had sort of tags relating to bits of discomfort. And came up with the 3 following games: Papers, Please, Darkest Dungeon and Fallout 4. And we explicitly decided not to include games that dealt with themes such as suicide and depression due to ethical reasons. And what we did is we asked players some questions in relation to something that happened in the game that made you feel uncomfortable. So we asked them to describe what it was, but also how they felt about it as well. We got 95 responses in total. The sample was primarily sort of biased towards male respondents, and that may be partly to do with how we advertised it on forums such as Reddit. But generally these were relatively experienced players that were targeted on the game forums related to each game. So we carried out a thematic analysis, and the first set of themes related to how discomfort manifests in games. The first theme is what we call the persistent pressure of uncertainty. So this is about how games essentially make people feel stressed and anxious because you're not really sure what's going to happen next, and you're kind of uncertain about whether you're going to succeed or fail. The next theme relates to failure in the sense of when plans don't necessarily pan out, so things don't go your way, and it's the aftermath of that, so how people feel after that's occurred. And that could be a mix of frustration, but also feelings such as feeling foolish, that they hadn't been able to succeed in what they were trying to do. The third theme is about loss. So this kind of relates probably a bit more closely to what Julia just presented. So it's about feeling attached to a character and then losing that character and feeling sadness or possibly even guilt around that. The fourth theme we called Great Responsibility but with Limited Power. So this is sort of an interesting one because it's a combination of two things. So the thing about games is that they give us a lot of responsibility. We're the ones who fail in the game. We're the ones who have to make these decisions. But at the same time, they kind of constrain that by constraining our choices and what we're actually capable of doing. And the final theme is unwanted exposure to disturbing themes. So here, the focus was on situations or events that related to themes that people found particularly uncomfortable and weren't expecting them and didn't necessarily want to have to deal with them. So I'll give you some examples of those as we go through the different games. So this is Papers, Please. It's a game where you play a border guard in a fictional Eastern European sort of country, and your job is to either decide who to let in and who not to let in based on the various documentation that you're provided with. And in Papers, Please, we definitely saw a lot of this uncertainty and pressure. So one of the things the game does is it gradually increases the number of documents and the things you have to look at in order to let people in. So this was described as being highly stressful due to having to keep up with these changing rules. Another example of one of the themes is the aftermath of failure. So here, somebody is referring to a scenario where it was their child's birthday in the game, but due to not being successful in processing enough people, they ended up feeling destroyed as they were unable to provide this gift to their child. So it just made me picture someone telling this poor child who was scared and hungry and cold that his birthday is met with no gifts, and just it broke his heart and mine. So we're getting quite an intense reaction to a scenario in the game where the person feels like they've failed in this instance. Now, Darkest Dungeon is quite a different kind of game. It's a dungeon crawler. You control a team of heroes that have to fight variously sort of horrifying kind of monsters and things. So it's quite big on its horror aesthetic, but it's also known for being notoriously difficult. So the challenge of this game is quite high. So we did see a lot of uncertainty there, but we also started to see things like the experience of loss. So here, someone was talking about one of their heroes who they named Dismas, and saying they felt despair when they died, and then grief as they fled back to the hamlet. And then we also saw this kind of mixture of feeling responsible but not having much power. So if you haven't played the game, I'm about to tell you a spoiler, so please stick your fingers in your ears. But essentially, in Darkest Dungeon, there's a point in the game where you have to sacrifice one of your heroes in order to complete it. So you're faced with this horrible choice that players describe as being really stressful and made them anxious, and they have this sense of overwhelming dread. So before, when the character died, it wasn't entirely my fault, but this time it was me. So I was the one killing them due to that particular choice. So again, you're provided with this is your fault because you're the one carrying out that action, but the game is not giving you sort of any other way out of it. And then Fallout 4 is an RPG set in a it's a series of games set in a post-apocalyptic future after a nuclear war. So you fight kind of lots of different kind of mutants and things and explore this sort of vast wasteland. And in this game, we again saw that mix of responsibility and power. So here, the participant is talking about a situation in the game where they felt that they were forced into killing a character who had been a friend of theirs. So I felt the story forced me to kill him, as any other outcome would have been narratively undesirable. So I wanted to complete the game, and I went through with it, but it was horrible. What they felt was horror, guilt, and shame. And then in terms of unwanted exposure, in another instance in Fallout 4, there was a participant who talked about a particular character in the game who had this backstory that was clearly quite kind of messed up. So that they'd obviously been through some pretty traumatic things. But as they were hearing this story, they felt distinctly uncomfortable, like I was listening to something I didn't want to hear and would rather be anywhere else. And I had to ask why the writers put in such context. So here, we're getting a sense of what happens if you go a bit too far, right? That people are starting to become disengaged and questioning why such things are in the game in the first place. So how discomfort influences engagement? There were three themes here. The first was about how to process uncomfortable experiences. So clearly people needed a bit of space sometimes to step away and process their emotions. We also saw discomfort as contributing to richer forms of gameplay experience. So people did appreciate this sort of thing. So the example here, they're actually in awe of the developers for making them feel such sort of complicated emotions as a result. And then finally, discomfort as a catalyst for reflection on life, the universe, and everything. So it's a bit of a long theme and a bit of a nod to Douglas Adams, but it's essentially trying to capture how games can sometimes get us thinking beyond the game itself around sort of societal issues and concerns. And this is an example of someone who came across a character in the game and started thinking about real life villains. So how do people in real life become these horrible kind of people? What shapes them into being the hateful people they become? And they actually went on to do further research on this and look at how people join things like supremacist organisations. So, basically, one of the main takeaways from this is that gameplay can sometimes be surprisingly painful. People are experiencing a range of emotions, and some of these are quite intense. Discomfort, we would say, is characterised by this lack of positive emotion and also the intensity of the response. So you had people experiencing quite extreme anxiety, but also things like guilt and shame and sort of feeling of helplessness as well. So from a design point of view, I guess there's a need to think about how people process their emotions and to give them time to do that. Discomfort was also seen to be a part of a sort of richer kind of player experiences, but you can also go a bit too far here and you run the risk of pushing people away and then disengaging with the content potentially. And then finally, discomfort can facilitate transformative reflection in some cases. So this is something that the next presentation may tell you a little bit more about, but it's essentially something I'd like to see further work on as well into how some people respond to these kind of episodes of discomfort by reflecting on wider things and wanting to find out more, and for some other people that doesn't seem to be the case. So it'd be great to know a bit more about that. So thank you very much for listening.
Adrian Schneider from Queen's University in Canada. I want to ask it sounded like your recruiting procedure was largely going to be with the specialized subforums. It sounded like it was largely going to be getting fans of the game, so I'm interested that you got people responding with the unwanted, like, game, why? No, stop it. How often did that happen? Was that a lot of things where they thought, game, I wish you wouldn't do this, but if I still like you, or did you get people that said, this is why I stopped playing this game?
Yeah, a little bit. I would say out of the 95, that wasn't a huge percentage of the people. So it was rarer that they said, it made me not want to play it anymore. But we did get a few responses like that. Primarily, it was, yes, I felt bad, but either I liked other bits of the game more, or that that was okay because it felt like a nice, interesting, complex experience.
Hi, it's Joe Halifax, University Jean Moulin in Lyon, France. I wonder if you had any sort of ideas or something out in your data about differing reactions to when the player was forced to make a choice that they might have disliked versus the players watching a scene or something unfolding in front of them. Like the difference between the players having to make the difficult and the uncomfortable choices, whether just experiencing an uncomfortable situation.
I probably have to look at the data set again to be sure, but my impression is that if it was more the latter, then we were getting the theme of sort of the unwanted exposure. Like I have no control and you're forcing this on me. Whereas I think what we're seeing more in the theme of the sort of responsibility but limited power, that's the one where they have a choice, but they're not necessarily feeling like they've got much of a choice. But there's a distinction there, you're right. Yeah.
Max Berg, Eindhoven University of Technology. Thank you very much for your talk, Joel. Like coming back to kind of the recruitment group, basically. Can you describe a little bit more in depth who those people were? Like that's one part, like the individual difference actually in your group, like the descriptive data, basically.
Yeah.
I think that's one part, and the other part is actually like in terms of we find these effects. Okay, people have those experiences. That's what the qualitative data tells us. but do we have a sense of quantification of that? Like how often does it occur? Is it like everyone is affected by these stories? You have to buy into it, basically, is what I'm saying.
Right, yeah. So a quick answer to your second part of that question is from this data, I wouldn't want to start quantifying it because it was a sort of opportunistic sample, right? So I suspect it happens more than we realise, but further work needs to be done that looks at the sort of numbers around that. For the first bit, I'm going to struggle to remember the details, but part of the reason we targeted sort of specific like sort of Reddit threads or particular game forums was because we had these 3 games pre-selected. So that's how we got our sample. In terms of how they differed, is that what you're asking, between the games?
Between the games, but also like what was that population? Like how were they, what's their play experience, how much do they play,
Oh, okay,
how much
yeah.
do they like...
So there is a bit more of that in the paper. Generally speaking, they were quite regular sort of games players, and that varied. Some a lot, some just regularly but less often. Less long. They differed slightly. So the Fallout group was slightly older. The average age was about 30 for that, and the other 2 was probably closer to the mid-20s. And it was Darkest Dungeon group that was the most male biased. But there are more details in the paper if you want to check that out. So.
Thanks again to Joe. And we said it's the same mathematics to the next paper on mathematics for
Hello. Yeah, thank you very much for joining. So yeah, I'm Matthew V. I'm based in the University of New York, and I'm doing my sort of foundational research for my PhD project. So before I dive into exactly what a perceptive challenge moment is and how we defined it, I've sort of been situating my work within the sort of field of eudaimonic experiences, so moments that sort of provoke more thoughtful or allows you to, rather than sort of like being distinctly engaging in a sort of hedonic sense, more things that can make you go, and I've sort of also been looking at a bit of like reflection and the sort of reflection field around sort of HCI. And one of the sort of like core cases I started with, I was looking at Bournemouth's reflective informatics. And basically, Bournemouth, he went out and collected all the domains that mention reflection and compared them for what, rather than sort of saying how they differed, he looked at the similarities. And he came up with 3 different dimensions. And while these weren't applied to games, they sort of like, they're quite easy to sort of draw simple comparisons. So the first was breakdown, and he sort of defined breakdowns as moments when, sort of prompt reflection, you are shown something that puts you in doubt, it catches you off surprise, there's sort of raising questions. And I'd argue games like XCOM do that quite well. It says 83%, it probably still will miss. Following up from that, there was the inquiry, and that is when now that you've had this sort of initial breakdown, the sort of, you begin to sort of say, okay, well, I've been given this new information, how can I sort of begin to sort of dig into it a little bit deeper, and sort of you begin to sort of ask questions. And then lastly, there's transformation, and that is you go to the point where, okay, you change with as a result of this sort of reflective experience. So, looking at this whole sort of like reflection thing, I'm saying that perceptive challenging moments are reflective in nature, and a perceptive challenging moment is something that we've defined as when you begin to experience things one way, and then something happens that suddenly changes that perspective. And this is what we, this is how we presented it, or the definition, to our participants. So what exactly did we do? We did a sort of corporate survey. There's an OSS link there if anyone wants it, and all the data is available online with our pre-registration. We had 4 open-ended questions, and that was asking players to report a moment where a game challenged their perspective, what they think caused that moment, and then to go into detail as to if it had any internal effects. So did it change the way they played the game, or external effects, as well as sort of like demographical questions and some Likert scale questions to measure their enjoyment or appreciation experience. And then we sort of took that into the responses into in vivo and just did multiple sort of coding passes of trying to categorize these different causes and consequences. The participants we gathered through multiple different sources, posted around on a whole host of Reddit sites, retweeted a few times on Twitter, and thrown out onto as many Facebook groups as I could get my hands on. Shockingly, it resulted in predominantly experienced male gamers. So we're looking at 76 males, typically been gaming for 20 years, and it kind of fluctuated on average, but typically 4 to 6 hours per week. So yeah, so this is the sort of the sample that we're dealing with for our research. And the very interesting thing is we gathered, 101 participants, and we gave participants a chance to report multiple moments. So of the 101 participants, we had 132 moments reported and 90 unique games. So these games that I'm showing here, these were the most common. The Witness, that only had 6 counts. So it's kind of showing that if the players are reporting protection moments, it's something of a wider occurring phenomenon. Now, as a consequence of these moments, we sort of begin to sort of categorize them into sort of different groups. The change in playstyle was the most common consequence, and this was defined as a result of this moment, how the players have meaningfully or just in some way changed the manner in which they played. Followed up by having a sort of emotional response, whether that was feeling sad or if I follow on with the next thing, we discovered that there was a sort of there was an experience of when people were beginning to reflect the point of transformation, and we found that there were 2 distinct types: the endo and exo transformation. So when endo transformation is basically when people are prompted with something and they begin to have sort of considerations. If those considerations are about the game, and it's an endo transformation, and if those considerations are about the beyond the game, it is an exo transformation. And as a result of these moments, if their playstyle changes, then they have changed within the context of the game. And if they begin to think philosophically different as a result of this game, which came up once or twice, then it is a sort of exo transformation. So to sort of give it a little bit more example, the exo transformations were less common, but in a game known as an ASCII Life, which tries to get players to experience what it's like living day to day with Asperger's syndrome, this was one such sort of participant, and as a result, his perspective, basically, he had a change in how he viewed other humans, so a human consideration. Now back into endo, so the sort of things that are sort of unique to games, we have the classic case of Spectre's Line. And as a result, this player adapted the way they changed, the way they played the game, to hesitate when taking on firefights, naturally assuming that there would be a civilian or someone accidentally caught in their crossfire. But that wasn't the only way. It wasn't just gameplay. Sometimes these moments actually cause players to think about characters differently. So in the same way that the EXO was talking about human considerations and thinking about humans differently, this is one where they sort of viewed the protagonist Aloy from Horizon Zero Dawn just a little bit differently. Now, when we look at, so that was this sort of reversal breakdown of like, okay, as a result of these moments, what sort of happened, we began to sort of look at the causes. And by far, most of these perspective changing moments were caused by the narrative. While like I said, while that is an interesting finding, what I think is interesting, because we're studying games, and that's kind of what I'm interested in, is game systems are obviously something that is unique to games, and narrative is obviously it's existing in films, it's existing in books. So I think there's some interesting things there to sort of break down further, like how exactly have game systems themselves challenged someone's existing perspective. And they did this in quite a few different ways. One was through sort of having like a sort of emergent world or narrative. So Dwarf Fortress, being that the narrative of the entire game is sort of brought up from the game itself. The example given was the guy was building forts perfectly efficiently until a dwarf went through a adventurous journey that he decided to start rebuilding his house's comfort, he started making rooms double the size, putting carpets in them for only like the comfort of a ASCII square. They also use mimetic mechanics. So one of the negative experiences we had was Piston talking about the torture scene in GTA 5. And that's because the controls you need to do embody and actually expect you to carry out a torture scene. And then lastly, there is procedural rhetoric. And one of the most common example, The Witness, did this very well in the way that the whole game is trying to get you to look at things from a different perspective, which is very relevant. But there's a big reveal towards the end. There's also moments where the narrative and the game system are working together. So meaningful choices in games like The Witcher. And also being sort of self-aware, so things like Doki Doki Literature Club, The Beginner's Guide, and the Stanley Parable were common games also titled. To sort of summarize everything, endo transformations occur much more frequently than exo ones. So players are sort of adapting the way they play based on these moments. Perspective changing moments are widely occurring, and from the results of the Likert scales, which you found in the paper, they were very widely enjoyed, appreciated, and left a sort of like lasting impression. I do believe they are reflective of nature. They are uniquely caused by systems in games, and sometimes that can be combined with the narrative to sort of allow players to make a meaningful choice. And a change in playstyle was the most common consequence. So some further ramifications for the work is obviously some of this has impacts on the way we can design games, and the fact that these moments were widely enjoyed. It could be an incentive for designers to try and incorporate into the games. And next would be sort of starting to contact industry, and now that we have the player perspective, well, we don't know if these moments were potentially intentionally designed for, or just a happy byproduct of 101 other sort of design decisions. So yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Hello, Christoph Fink from the Technical University of Vienna. Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. You mentioned before that this meaningful experience is sometimes combined with the narrative.
Yes.
So when I play games and I get one of these important emotional moments, I find that they come most powerfully when they are combined with the narrative. So I'm wondering what a moment that powerful would look like if there was not any sort of narrative involved at all.
So the some of the best examples of games that sort of prompted these moments without necessarily a narrative surrounding it. The Braid is, well, Braid does have the narrative around it. I'm going to give a spoiler for The Witness. I hope people don't mind. But the entire game is a bunch of perspective puzzles. So you stand in certain places at certain points. At a certain point in the game, it's revealed that there are puzzles beyond the puzzles. So if you take a step back and look, the trees themselves, the entire world, is these line puzzles. So it's sort of the wider message is purely sort of occurring throughout the mechanics, and that sort of goes back to sort of the procedural railroad category that we mentioned. So it's rare, but players have sort of picked up on it, and there's a reason why The Witness was mentioned game, because players who are committed enough tend to sort of come across these moments. So.
Thank you.
It's okay.
Stuart Halifax from University of Lyon. On the effects of these impact moments on players, I didn't see any. The question was like, did you ever see the case where your interviewees said, "I just simply stopped playing from this level of stress"? Did that not come up, or is it one of these?
Yeah, so basically, I think that sort of that fell under the sort of change in play style. So it's such an extreme change that they stopped. That's kind of happened. So it did occur once or twice. I think the GTA moment I mentioned, that was one moment where the player stopped playing because their progress was gated by this. Another one was there was a narrative reveal that they didn't like, so they just like, I'm just not going to play anymore. so yeah, no, so it was a mixture, but that's how I sort of categorized it.
It was more of the idea of like for designers that could be a good thing to look at is if people do stop playing through choices.
Unfortunately, it was like 1 or 2 accounts in the case. I don't think.
Okay, thank you, Matthew, again. Sringi is presenting a paper on the role of uncertainty as an important player motivation to graph its theory.
I wanted to do. Yeah, it does. Yeah, it does work.
As well. Max? All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. It's really delightful to be here at KiteLand. I'm Sringi, and I'm a game designer and I'm a game researcher at University of York, looking at actually stage magic and game design. But for this talk, looking at why do players do what they do from one moment to the next, and how can we create these moments using different principles from different creative fields. So our main question over here was, in a tied game loop, from one moment to another, what is it that's making people go from one moment to another? And we found many established principles like progress, rewards, event routine, goals, achievements. But one underlying thing that really stood out for the data set we had was uncertainty. And so uncertainty is known as a key player experience. It's not new. A lot of games designers and game researchers have already talked about uncertainty as a key player experience. However, so far, the taxonomies of uncertainty that we have are theory-derived, and they jump analysis levels. What I mean by that is, for example, Costikyan has something called narrative anticipation. What that means is that players want to know what's going to happen next in terms of what's going to happen next in the game, in terms of what are they going to do next, in terms of the story. So it's quite a macro level of uncertainty about a game. But he also has something like performance uncertainty, which is how am I going to react next, which is quite a macro level. So there's an analysis gap over there. It's still very useful, but unfortunately there are these discrepancies. These existing taxonomies also do not address when exactly is uncertainty motivating. Like Joe pointed out, it's not always a motivating thing. So when exactly is it motivating, and why? Why is it motivating if it is? So we tried to address this by grounding it in data and naturalistic observations as well. And more importantly, doing a moment-to-moment scrutiny rather than a summative post-hoc analysis, asking players post-hoc what happened, like leaves out nuances of these kind of quite subtle experiences. So we wanted to do, like, really dissect the game and come up with conclusions. Let's see what sort of a job we've done. So for the analysis, we used a ground theory constructivist method. We had 13 interviewing participants, and we did interviews which were like an hour long or more. We also asked some of our participants to do a diary entry, cross-validate whether when they're playing in their natural environment, is it similar experiences, and the questions were similar. And we also asked our participants to play the game in front of us, and made notes on what's happening, when are they giving a reaction, and then asking the questions back based on the particular observations in that game. It's important to note what our data set was. So our data set was of the games that can be played in those 5 minutes. So we needed games that players can have a satisfying session in those 5 minutes that they'll play in front of me. But also we wanted something which does not have too complex game elements or game mechanics, so that we can actually ask questions going deeply into different game elements. So in our paper we call this a casual game set. But within it, we try to be as diverse as possible. So we did have a Candy Crush, but we had Super Hexagon, we had Monument Valley, we had a strategy game, we had a sport game. So within that data set, we went as sparse as we could. On top of that, it's important to note that when choosing the players, we wanted players who have different experiences. So not players who play only this game. There were players who would play only a Candy Crush, and there were players who would play a Candy Crush but also play what we call much more serious and doing games. So we try to have a variation over there. So looking at what is the sources of uncertainty and why am I calling it a moment-to-moment experience. So we divided our uncertainty taxonomy based on the source of it. So the game, so what's going to happen next? What new character is going to come? How the level is designed? What's going to happen in the game next? The players are curious to find out what's going to happen. And then moving on from there, how am I going to react to what is going to happen? So when those two uncertainties are solved, what is the outcome of what I did? Quite simple really, but let's look at a game too. So in this game, Super Hexagon, you're like, so what's going to happen next? What's the new pattern that's going to come? How am I going to react to it? Should I go left? Should I go right? Will I be fast enough? And finally, what's the outcome? Did I make it? What's my score? So on. So all of these uncertainties looping into each other, wanting you to go on and on and on. So this is the same diagram, but with our more elaborate taxonomy. I won't go into it, but we can talk about it. It's in the paper. But we will go through some examples to get a flavor of this. So like I said, game uncertainty is what is the game going to throw at me next? So what's the new content? Content uncertainty, that is characters or mechanics, not mechanics, characters or NPCs, etc. And configuration uncertainty. So we know what the content is, but how's the configuration going to change, like we saw in Super Hexagon. We have to note that the questions we asked was what is motivating about uncertainty, not just picking out uncertainties. So here, a player says, I want to continue because what if you find another world on the other side? So the motivation is discovery, and there's uncertainty of what's going to happen next. As an example of configuration uncertainty, a player says, I had a split second of hesitation that I didn't recognize it, the coming pattern. Had I beaten it, I would feel pretty smug. So they don't know what's going to come, and the motivation is to beat it. So that's going to player uncertainty, sort of hinting of perceived competence. So that smoothly goes into player uncertainty. So now the player knows what's coming next. And now it's like, how am I going to react to this? How much do you want to hit? Where you want to aim? So these decision makings. These decision making can also be quite long term. So I have collected a resource. How should I actually kind of use this resource? This is the right time for longer term strategies. Now that I've made the decisions, that uncertainty of how will I act is solved. But will I be able to interact? Will I be able to do it on time? So going back to Super Hexagon, will I be able to hit and move at the right time? No, not gonna make it in time unless I was actually quick enough. So this is a player talking to themselves and feeling happy. In this case, they did it, and they were quite happy that they did. And then, moving from the interaction uncertainty in a slightly long-term sense of, will I be continuing to be able to do that? So I know that I can do the reaction. I know that I'm able to make the decisions, but can I adapt to the difficulty that the game is going to do? So this feeds a bit more into the motivational constructs of mastery, leading to our third kind of main source of uncertainty. So now the player knows what the game is going to bring. They know how they acted with it, but what is the outcome? What happened as a result? So uncertainty is motivating when it's not completely predictable. Like the outcome is not completely predictable, so that the result, the player says a completely predictable game will not be fun. Well, and at the same time, if it's a multiplayer game, seeing whether the opponent or the co-op, how will they react. So I did my bit, but you don't know what they're going to do. So you don't know when they're going to attack, for example. So we linked all of these uncertainties with existing motivational constructs, which you can see in the paper. But as I've highlighted, curiosity being one of the biggest motivational links between insanity. So to conclude and state the limitations, so we finally, I'm saying good things about myself. So we finally have an empirically grounded taxonomy of uncertainty and no more theory-derived ones, especially focusing on a moment-to-moment loop. It's good news that it does partially map with what with Kostikian's 11 sources of uncertainty. However, it extends it, so there are some uncertainty types that you'll see in the paper that were not covered in Kostikian's system, and also cleans the analysis level gaps. With our motivational construct, we say why were these uncertainties motivating, and when exactly in the loop that we described. Curiosity being the main. I would obviously highlight that it is a qualitative work. We would like to do different types of methodologies to cross-check it, and of course our data set is limited, so we need to see different games in different players. With that, I'm done, and I would end this with Hitchcock's quote saying, "There is no terror in the bang, only in the anticipation of it." Thank you very much.
Thank you for showing the limitations. I think that's quite important because there is a question whether you had another group of subjects. Would this happen again? I didn't see the numbers you had, so I'm not sure how you measured this empirically, because you said that this was grounded empirically. But I do appreciate that you did show the limitations, because there is a question about, you know, if you're able to replicate this, and not just your work in general, when you have quantitative data, this happens a lot, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we don't know. I mean, subjects tend to place the experiment and so forth. So, but I didn't see numbers. Where are your numbers?
I don't have it on the slides, it's in the paper. We had, it's a grounded theory work, so these are interviews. So we conducted interviews with 13 players, but there were 3 methods that they followed. This is, they did open interviews. Some of the players entered diary entries. So over a week of time, they were answering questions about their player experience, and they did video recall. So they played in front of me, and they had the answers. And then I did the constructivist ground theory methodology to come up with this taxonomy. You're right that why I call it empirical is because the data set, even though it's qualitative, it's repeated. So that's why the coding is helping us to say that this is supporting. That's the whole point of the exercise, that we code and then we keep supporting the data with the new entry we're going, and we go back and look at the questions and the methods. So that's why the word empirical is used. I understand that it's a bit confusing. And your last part saying that will other players behave like this? So again, we saw a theoretical saturation with 13 players. That's why we stopped at that point. So it's not that we decided that we'll have 13 players and stop. We came with, after around 11 players, we started seeing a theoretical saturation in the data. And there are previous studies that show that generally grounded theory work, especially with something a bit obvious like this, around 12 you see a data saturation. The data set is limited to the games that we had, like I said, but within that we have the diversity. Of course, this is certainly not applicable to all games right now, and that's why we have this brilliant research people who go on.
Right, and yeah, because there is the question whether, you know, between internal and external validation, right?
Come again?
Between external and internal validation, right? So because the less control, you lose the internal validation.
I'm not completely following
right.
the...
Okay. But thank you for your...
Yeah, thank you so much.
That is Dennis from National University of Singapore. I've done a little bit of work related to moment, not necessarily in games. So I do have a question, and this might be out of the scope of what you're doing, but you did quote someone mentioning anticipation. So right now, your curiosities that you have mentioned seem to be related. These things that you have identified seem to assume that the players have to know for certain, right? Maybe if you go back a few slides. Yeah, so these uncertainties, it seems to assume that the players have to have decided that it's no longer uncertain before maybe something else can happen, right? Am I right to say that?
So partly. So there's a sweet spot of uncertainty. So you're right about that.
Right. So part of that question is where do you think this idea of anticipation comes in? Because in anticipation, it's not necessary that uncertainties are resolved.
Yeah. Actually, I should have not said that all the uncertainties are solved, and thank you for pointing that out. So the anticipation, we did a bit of reading on anticipation, and it's outside the scope of my research, as I said. But we did a bit of reading, and the idea was that first of all, uncertainty has a sweet spot. So like I mentioned in another talk over here, that if it's completely predictable or completely unpredictable, there can be frustration or there can be boredom, right? So there's that sweet spot. And the anticipation at the same time, at least from the player data, seemed like when they can sort of guess, but they're still like curious about what's going to happen. And I think it's quite similar with a lot of storytelling, that you sort of have a scope of your characters and scope of the world decided by the game, so the anticipation is within that world, so you're not feeling abandoned by the game, so to say, and that's where the curiosity is kind of sweet. When it becomes too much of, I don't know what's going to happen, and I feel that that's not where it starts to work. I hope that answers it.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again, and thank you again for explaining. And the next presentation is by a young researcher from the University of Waterloo. Then I think the next presentation is player traits and video game craftsmanship for the part of this.
Okay, we're gonna go live. Somebody can hold it for me. I don't know, pass it around. Actually, I should just pass it around. Maybe everyone can hold it a little bit. Yeah? You don't do that? Okay, perfect. Well, thank you everyone for showing up for my talk. My name is Gustavo Candello, and so Gustavo couldn't make it, sadly. My PhD student, former PhD student, now doctor of computer science, wrote this paper about player traits and video gaming preferences, player characteristics. We really wanted to investigate what models of player preferences explain game choice, and it's not this one. So we had we've of course worked in the field of player modeling and player types for a while, and really one of the oldest ones, and it's still around, is Bartle's player types model, and I love Bartle, but I hate the model, so it just needs to disappear. It was made for MUDs, it's from the 1996, it's not really useful for games research. This graphic is actually taken from a gamification at work paper from Mario Herger and some excellent colleagues. It has nothing to do with gamification. It has not a lot of implications for the games research that you're using. It is overused in the games industry. Please stop using it. Another one, and my colleague Regan Mandick and myself and our colleague actually Chris Bateman are partially responsible for this one. Chris, though, was sort of the originator of this idea for brain hacks, which we published in 2014. But this was work that originated from his agency, and he did a lot of work theoretically on trying to tie some of the ideas from neurobiological findings into what I still think is a very interesting model of player theory. And again, I love Chris, and I hate my models. His model, our model. I don't hate it actually. It's just, again, it is, okay, so here's the thing. It's a good model, but it's not a good questionnaire. And so to operationalize research and to make sure that this research works out, you need to sometimes acknowledge that there is a problem with how we're operationalizing it. And so I figured that that's the case, and sat down with, back then, my PhD student. This was a longer project over years and years and years. So we sat down on our magical unicorn and decided that we need to figure out how to fix this, and ended up collecting a lot of different data sets to hopefully at some point figure this out, and a couple of papers have been the result of this. So obviously there are issues with existing player type. Players do not only enjoy one type of experience. This was something that was pretty clear to us when we came up with the typology. It became even clearer to us when we submitted paper over paper and we got psychological reviewers to tell us that this was really a thing in psychology in what year was that? Earlier than the 2000s. You were really outdated here, people. You need to kind of get on the train. Because modern psychology is just, there's different camps, and traits is essentially one of the better ways of explaining it, according to the majority of psychological reviewers anyway. So we were thinking, yeah, maybe we can do something with it, and you might disagree in the question after you're already looking at me like this. I know Max also has a background in psychology. Okay, so anyway, so there is essentially a lack of a validated good scale available for player types, because again, in games we're a little behind. It takes a little while to catch up with things, and sometimes that's a decade. So player traits recognize that people's preferences are composed of different characteristics, not just one characteristic. So we came up with a cool player traits model, yay us, and we actually got it published at Interact recently. It is an actually validated 25-item measurement scale that I can only recommend for people to check out if they're interested in these types of personality traits. And it correlates with personality traits, so the player traits and personality traits correlates. This was a whole different study that we did, again, in Interact. If you're interested, you can download it at acfgames.com/player-traits. And so the interesting thing was that it actually held up. These traits were quite nice. The names, okay, we could have come up with catchier names, but they kind of explain the social narrative, aesthetic challenge, and goal orientations that we had in that model. But, we wouldn't be good researchers if we didn't know how to slice the salami appropriately. And so essentially what happened is Gustavo collected a lot of data, and I'm talking about a lot of data over the years. And we, again, analyzed this data set in one paper where we came up with a player traits model. And then we also noticed, hey, we've got this cool methodology that came out of us analyzing 50,000 responses of the original BrainHacks data that actually helped us filter responses based on when people said, okay, this is the game I like. So this was actually based on when we wrote our initial, you could call it rebuttal paper about BrainHacks for the International Journal of HCI. And we said, this is kind of a better way of doing this, which kind of led to the traits, which now led to us looking at, hey, so how can we actually predict some sort of preferred game styles, and how can we relate that back to player trait scores? So one sample, data sample at least, could explain the player trait scores, but that was the most recent one. But then we also had preferred game and relevant playing styles, and gender and age. How do all of these things influence the choice of games? And this is based on the choice of games self-selected by the players in these questionnaires. So often you find these studies where people are trying to cluster things according to genres of things. But again, genres are based on people's interpretation. This is based on us telling you, tell us what game you like. Give us, actually the question was, please name up to 3 games that exemplify the type of games you like. And then we cleaned that data with several algorithms that we wrote about clustering and putting those games together into things. And we came up with charts and charts and charts and more charts. There's so many charts in the paper, you're going to have a good time if you like a lot of data density and charts and tables. We have a lot of that in the paper. Please read it. So I want to just, because we have a limited time in this talk, really talk about the relations between the player traits and the games that we found here. And so one of the things that we found, again, I'm going to go over these traits. Social is actually the interesting one, because to explain what social orientation means as a player trait is that players who score high in this trait are people that like to play together with others, people that enjoy multiplayer games and competitive gaming communities, and people who score low prefer to play alone. That's kind of how you explain this trait. Again, it's a continuous scale. But as you can see, it's kind of interesting how that actually, and this is based on significance testing that we did, non-parametric with R. Holy crap, I could not do it myself, but Gustavo pulled it all off. So pretty awesome if you want to check the stats. Belgium, it's in the paper. And so here what we can find is that it actually is a significant predictor of the type of social orientation. You can see a lot of these multiplayer games up there, which are collaborative and sometimes competitive, but basically team-based. And then we have these single-player games on the bottom mainly. So that's quite interesting how really that was significant. And then in terms of aesthetic orientation, this is a clustering for players who score high on exploring the world. Oh, geez, I really scored. So players that score high on exploring the world, enjoying the scenery and appreciating graphics, and players who score low and then you focus more on the gameplay and the aesthetics of the game. So some people really like the exploring part, but some people just like the gameplay. And you can see that here, again, a significant predictor. We've got narrative orientation, so players that score high like complex narratives and stories with games. Players that score low prefer games with less story, and might skip the story and the cutscenes and like the way of playing Super Mario, Fortnite, Pokemon. The story in there maybe, but not the most important bit. Challenge orientations are players who score high in like difficult games and hard challenges, Counter-Strike, League of Legends, Monster Hunter, Witcher, Dark Souls, of course. Players who score low prefer easier or casual games, Zelda, Persona, Pokemon. And this could be, of course, an argument with people here that some of these games you can play in different ways, of course. Goal orientations are players that score high and enjoy completing game goals and like completed games to 100% level and want to explore all the options, and players that score low on goal orientation want to leave optional quests or achievements unfinished. Interesting thing here is Minecraft, because as you know, Minecraft is not a game that is specifically goal-oriented, but we explained the high drive towards goal orientation there, that people are actually self-driven to complete their goals and have this idea that I really want to complete that goal. Now, age, there's also a difference. Apparently older people really like World of Warcraft and Civilization. Younger people like Call of Duty and Borderlands and other games, Overwatch. In terms of gender, and do not despair, dear unicorns in the audience, we of course asked them to identify as non-binary and self-identify them, but we unfortunately did not have enough data to cluster it according to that, so we're using this binary cluster for gender, and I know it's not necessarily the best way of doing it, but you can see that at least statistically, we have women preferring games like Stardew Valley, Kingdom Hearts, and men preferring Rocket League, XCOM, some of these games. Quite interesting, maybe controversial findings. Takeaways here is we introduced the scale, we showed that they relate to game elements, we showed that gender and age are related to preferences, we mapped the characteristics, we created a lot of charts. How can you use this? You can better understand game tests, you can do designs and game studies with more accurate insights about the audience, you can target market campaigns to the right audience. It really helps you understand your player base. And future work could be larger samples. Please use it for larger samples for the validation, correlations with other models, and compare participants' self-reported preferences with the actual behavior in games. Thank you very much. I actually went over because you might see there's a line, if you have questions. If you have questions, please send them. If you have questions.
If you have questions, ask them right now.
Oh, Daryl, please. Oh my God.
Okay, thank you, Pedro van Rabin. Okay,
It was a Crystal Wallace test.
yeah. So, does this mean, what does this mean for Hexa? Let's assume I want to build a recommender engine and I want this knowledge of my players. Are you suggesting that I should base my recommender on Hexa, or is that now out of the door, and should I use the trait model?
This is a very, very, very excellent question, actually. Thank you, very great question. The intention here is different because this is work stemming out, and this is like two stepchildren we're talking about. One was our BrainHex work, which was always intended for game players, and one was Hexa, which, and this is an interesting discussion with this crowd, was always intended for gamification. And I could go off on a 10-minute rant about the difference between gamification and gameful designs versus actually game designs, because I do, and Gustavo is even stronger than me in that distinction. There is a very distinct preference whether you're designing a gameful system or you're designing a game system. And so Hexa is specifically for those gameful systems. It's a tool that you design gamification with. Whereas these player traits are definitely about real games, the kind of games that we play and engage with. So if you're building your recommender system, which I actually would love to see, next KaiPlay, recommender system, I would recommend that recommender system for games if you're building it with the 5-player traits. If you're building it with gamification, use Hexa. Thank you. Oh man, really?
Catherine Gerling, Caleb, from Belgium. What's the risk of alienating minority player groups by these categorizations?
Yeah, this is, do you want me to skip to the unicorns again? This is essentially the risk every time. This could go deeper. Every time you want to bin something quantitatively, you risk alienating people. That is just the nature of things. So, yes, I could have done qualitative work, but I chose to do quantitative work, and I chose to have a certain cutoff point. And unfortunately, that cutoff point meant eliminating some things, eliminating some game choices and preferences, eliminating some other demographic choices and preferences that were available. We did give the option, and we were yearning actually for more data in those categories. But as you know, when you run quantitative statistics, if you don't have that data, you cannot report these things. So unfortunately, I cannot report them. I would love to in the future.
I have more questions that I will ask.
You should allow for one question outside of Belgium.
Yes, please.
So, I'm from the Netherlands, which is... First of all, thank you for your playful talk. It's really nice to open this in this way. So, you said, I like Bardal, I don't like the model, of course. I can understand it's outdated, so awful. And I remember in this paper, he has also this ASCII-like thing with if there are more killers, then there are less socializers. All these guys in the dependencies, right?
He also updated it 2 years later for 8 categories, which is never used. And he actually said, this is much better. Please use this new dimensionality, and nobody ever picked up on it. So yeah, and he built it for MUDs originally, for multi-user text dungeons.
But the perspective he also uses is like the interdimension between if there are more of these kind of players, then the other kind of players will go down. Would it be possible with a trade kind of approach? Would you see something in there that you could make a game more for that person, so there will be less of that other kind of trade?
See, this is the difference, in my opinion anyways, between a trait and a type-based approach. In a type-based approach, I would say that is probably likely, but the whole idea of a trait is that you can have differently pronounced traits in the same person, right? So it's not necessarily mutually exclusive, right? I could score high on 2 different traits that help characterize my playing preference.
Okay, so thanks again to Lennart. Thanks to all the speakers.
Thank you very much. Enjoy the coffee break. Bye, also. 30% off.
So Yeah, yeah.
Si, mais va pas. Tu pars tout de suite, Élise, ou tu prends un café?
Hein? Là, je vais prendre un truc à manger et après je rentre.
Bah, à tout à l'heure. On se tient au courant pour comment on y va.
I'm very happy to have joined here. Sorry? Yeah, I know. Finally,
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's fun times.
That was a good session. Yes.
There's somebody else who's going
In my experience, interactive narrative is a form of game.
Oh, they got, now they get rid of time.
Yeah. No, it's not. So the elements embedding narrative associated with narrative means basically games, prefer games that have a lot of complex stories or narratives within the game, and then that's more of a less story, and then seems like it's the way of the animation. We already tell you we had a researcher. Yeah. I haven't heard that's the saddest side. I think it was no, actually, he just said I did for half an hour. I thought it was oh wow. Hey, by the way, I'm friends on the website. We've already used the yeah, let me know. Yeah, great. Thanks for no, exactly. So think about it. Henry, yeah, doesn't matter so much where they're coming from. He's brain yeah, and it's shaking it off. But he is not making a mistake. This is the question itself with the asthma when he was building it. He said, hey, you're academics, I need your help. Can you fix this thing before it goes out? Then he would understand. So we got a chance to fix this question. I got it before it goes out.
You can imagine one side top down manage the shit out of it, and I'm like, okay, so
yeah, and it definitely is a big help right? It's much better than and always green text it has to use like how to every time they come like congratulations, thank you very much. Actually working one of these great well, yes. And really, to be honest, you could have called it more crazy heights to take them really more, straight but yeah, it's called it really black. Now with our knowledge, yeah, makes a great motivation next time.
And again, the way Hexagon is phrased, the percentages is really more like traits. Yeah, no, you phrase one policy. Yeah, but conceptually, the question is yeah, I think both of them are useful, but I get what you're saying. It might be hard to explain. More interesting. Yeah, we did that last year. Yeah, so that was my paper. Yeah, no, that's too heavy. That's not. That's all we're reading. All I'm reading is on. That's not a catch up. That's very different from here. We actually work with it. This was more of a research method. Yeah, I mean, more like
Hi.
No problem. Thanks. I'm gonna try to stop by tomorrow.
Okay.
Got some free time.
Sweet.
Yeah, let me know if you want to join trivia. Just send me a message.
Okay. Sounds good. I talked to like 11ish by the way.
Okay. I have a meeting from 10 to 1, but I can do that.
Okay.
allows you to get an idea of
In terms of the central
now
feature.
yeah, you could say okay, it's like develop techniques. It's actually really good for marketing. You can say these are the kind of people that make Right now, it's a bit more useful than ever. Yeah, exactly. Oh, nice. It's like you're becoming a musician now. Yeah. Thanks for bringing the good stuff. Oh, so what almost like a gamification the player yeah, it's not validated. I don't think it works well because I think games is only kind of a thing where you find payment. You could have those two very different genre type things in a game application. You have pressing here and then you have some sort of I don't know. You could have something that you wouldn't find in the same game that are the same application. Yeah, I would actually, if I had this company, well, then I'm trying to write a grant with like so when I met him, it was a matchmaking, made him happy. Like, yeah, we know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Nice and fit.
Sometimes we design communication for the type of players and what they're going to
differences. Can we bring out these data traits? That was great. I don't think we can bring out this trait. The trait is by personality. More or less pronounced. Both train somebody who's more pronounced or something. But it's like a preference how you handle things. It really doesn't like one way to train themselves, write themselves, but most of their games. The question is, are they getting into it because it's something or they have a practice? There's a part of it, in social environment,
change through a character creator. I'm really scared that you might become like the warrior and I need to move forward. Can you actually use that role?
So first of all, I think we all also say that I want to refer to change the world, think of it, how we do that. So it's definitely an interesting question, and it's definitely something I don't if you want to do a nice little break,
It's going to be fairly easy, you know.
This time I really something like 15, 20 minutes. Yeah.
No, I think it's a case of everyone makes it. Oh, no. Does he want to be a buddy? Hell yeah, you want to be a success. These guys say that after I went back. I mean, I was the youngest. Yeah, this is the old guy. Yeah, you never mess with the old guy. Get back and sleep. All the things. Well, Vikings, yeah. Old guy with Vikings. Haven't seen it today, though. No, I have. Yeah, I've been keeping my eye on it, but everyone's not. That's it. Like, yes, I managed to do it. Yeah, really bad. Yeah, that's now. He was lacking down the Red Bull baby. Oh yeah. No, I staggered to the nearest coffee shop, just like bacon wrap. Yeah, one like very, very sugary hot chocolate with a tiny splash of caffeine in it. So I'm just it's very greasy. It's hot. Bacon and eggs. Bacon and eggs. Oh yeah.
Here, feedback processes in game industry. Are you presenting?
Yes. I'm last.
Yeah. Did you want to check your paper? Okay, so it should be. So it's 5, sorry, 10. Do we have an available room? Oh, are you? Oh, are you gonna be doing something?
Just a cookie or a half. If there's no cookies, they might all be gone.
I'll show them what we did, but I like how it's actually. So, but if not, I will send it. Right, right. With 1 minute. Is there another point here that I do we have the running mic?
But no, I was
Yeah. Any preference?
Hello, welcome to our session number 6, Broader Reflections. Thank you all for joining us. This is the last session of the day and in the afternoon, so I know everybody's tired, but it's so great to see so many of you still here with us today. We have a number of really exciting presentations, and I'm just going to kick it off right away and hand the mic over to Oliver.
Hello. Yes. Okay, so welcome. So it's a bit unfortunate not everyone's here yet because it's kind of front loaded. So if you missed the tech part, it's going to go into the rest of it. But hopefully you can feel people relating. So I'm Oliver. I'm a PhD student at the University of York, and this work was done in collaboration with another PhD student, Nathan, who's in the audience, and a bunch of our supervisors. So the most obvious question for me, reading the title, is what actually are crypto games? So can I just get a quick show of hands? Who knows roughly what a cryptocurrency is? Okay, cool. And who knows how they work? Okay, cool. Okay, so what are crypto games? So if I kind of frame this in terms of the traditional game design kind of
architecture. So you have typically a client-server model. So this is the game state stored on a server which is managed by the developer. So this is kind of an abstraction. So if you're using, for example, something like Amazon Web Services or servers, then the server is actually kind of a cloud, so it is in itself a network. But the emphasis with this kind of comparison is that it's centrally managed. So this really contrasts to the kind of crypto games architecture, in that instead of a client-server model, we have this kind of client-network model, where instead of the game state being stored on a single server or kind of the cloud, it's instead stored atop a cryptocurrency network, which is a network of computers which store a synchronized distributed ledger. So if that doesn't mean anything to you, then that's fine. The main takeaway from this is that by decentralizing the storage of the game state, you actually incur a cost, or more accurately, the client incurs some sort of cost. So in a game like, off the top of my head, something like World of Warcraft, Blizzard will probably be paying someone to host their servers, or they'll be hosting them themselves. And so the client does end up paying a monthly subscription, but they're not necessarily paying for the server directly. Whereas in crypto games, the client, that kind of cost of executing commands is actually transferred usually to the client. Another important point about this is that this is not kind of an A-B scenario here, this is like a spectrum. So it's kind of, on the typical model on the left, you have the entire game state stored on the developer server, and on the network one on the right, you have part or all of the game state on the server. So it's kind of like you have this kind of spectrum of how distributed you want the game to be. Yeah, so why should we care, right? Why is this a thing? This is hopefully the next obvious question. So it's a different premise for gaming, and so by storing the game state atop a cryptocurrency network, the tokens that you choose to hold in that game state enjoy all of the kind of security benefits of the cryptocurrency. So this is things like censorship resistance, resistance to tampering, and things like that. So there's that kind of hidden benefit, which is also part of why you would develop a big game like that. So there's a growing player base and trading volume. So a big emphasis of these games is the trading of virtual items between games and between players. Seems to be kind of the useful and interesting part of their design. And finally, so because they use cryptocurrency, it's a new payment mechanism, or more accurately, it's a new way of integrating payment into the design of these games. So, as the slide before, because the game state is held on a network, it means to change it, you have to initiate a transaction, and then that transaction obviously costs something. So it's not like you can just transfer the game state from a single server onto a network for free, free lunch break, no one has to pay for anything. Someone actually has to foot that cost. And so that's kind of something to keep in mind. So how does this actually manifest in terms of games that exist now? So we'll take two case studies. So the first one is Gods Unchained. So has anyone played Hearthstone? Okay, cool. So Hearthstone, Magic the Gathering, things like that, they're kind of competitive card games which emphasize deck building, so more powerful cards, things like that, and then there's kind of turn-based combat element. So in the case of Gods Unchained, the cards themselves are stored atop the Ethereum network. So Ethereum is a type of cryptocurrency, one of hundreds. It just so happens that it's the largest one by market capitalization that explicitly has the ability to implement the smart contracts, which is this underlying technical detail, which you find out more about in the paper. But it has that capacity. And so these are two examples of cards, and so in terms of art style and things, and function, they're very similar to Hearthstone cards, Magic the Gathering. And then second example is CryptoKitties. So this, you may have heard in the news, so this was really, really popular 2017, 2018. And so the whole thing is that you're collecting and breeding these digital kittens which have different attributes. And so the gameplay revolves around literally getting two kittens, and then you breed them through a web interface, and then there's this kind of element of chance where you're not sure which of the parents' attributes will be transferred to the child, and so on. And so this also uses the Ethereum network. So all of the studies that all of the games, that we sampled sit atop the Ethereum network, and they vary in terms of how decentralized they are. So this study, at least in this point, is just a single sample of a single type of cryptocurrency network. There's hundreds of different variations. This is really just kind of start the discussion about it. So what now? So we know in very high level terms there's something different with the storage and this is sort of technical, and they have this kind of different properties. So the client network model introduces costs. This is kind of inevitable. Costs will be kind of realized in a number of different ways depending on the type of cryptocurrency you're using, but generally they introduce costs. And chance-based mechanics exist. So kind of piggybacking on Trini's talk, uncertainty is kind of fun and interesting. It's kind of a really useful part of game design. And so this cost-chance combination, hopefully you can see there's something untoward here. So let's apply some definitions. This is kind of a realization that my co-author Nathan and I had in our lab when we were talking about it. We were like, huh, it's a little bit familiar to some. So which definitions do we apply? So we took 4 criteria from the gambling literature. So more accurately, the gambling studies literature, which is a branch of psychology. So this is, from a psychological perspective, which behaviors should be of interest in terms of how they're different to just normal types of risk. Right? So what separates one activity from another in terms of its relation to gambling? And 2 criteria from the UK Gambling Act. So I know we're in Spain right now, so this study is specific to the UK. So we took the psychological, so a 4-point criteria from the psychological literature, a 2-point criteria from the legal kind of literature, and we essentially combined them because one of the legal ones actually turned out to be pretty much identical to one of the psychological ones. So it made sense that we could make this kind of combined definition so it's useful pretty much for everyone. Because ultimately, if you're looking at an activity and it meets the psychological definition of gambling but doesn't meet the legal definition of gambling, then you have this kind of weird difference, like should we be interested in it? Should regulators be interested in it? Sorry. And so it makes a little bit more sense to combine. So the key finding was that typical gameplay in all of the sampled games met our combined definition. So typical gameplay here, we took to mean the gameplay that was advertised in marketing materials, in gameplay videos and things like that, and kind of the typical gameplay. So, in summary, and kind of if you are more interested in this and more interested in the technical side of things as well, you will find in the paper a sample of popular crypto games on the Ethereum network in particular. You'll find a description of their mechanics and their prevalence. So, because they exist atop a cryptocurrency network, that means that all of the user interactions, all of the transactions that they create are publicly observable, which means that from a research perspective, we can see literally everything that the users are doing for the game state, for the part of the game state that they're modifying, which sits at the top of the network. We then applied legal and psychological definitions of gambling and found that the entire sample met all of the definitional criteria. Again, this is just a small sample of crypto games just on one cryptocurrency, and this varies immensely. So to conclude, so we're here, so that's me in front of my favorite color, and Nathan is sat in the audience, and the paper is pinned on my Twitter, I think on Nathan's Twitter as well, and this entire paper wouldn't be possible without all of the co-authors as well. So that's Sebastian, Anders, James, and David, and there's also their contact information. Thank you.
Questions? Ooh, questions. Right, you can you give any of the definitions, the criteria? Because I'm really curious now. Yeah, let's answer it.
Okay, so they're split, so obviously in the paper, but so the legal definitions is something like there is an element of chance which determines the exchange, and that the exchange is money or money's worth. So in other words, if I were to I don't know, bet 3 bananas on the roulette wheel, then that wouldn't be the legal definition, but if it was free sterling on the roulette wheel, then it would. And then so the psychological definition, off the top of my head, it's kind of along the vein of is the exchange determined by chance? Is there some exchange of financial value? I think that it's a little bit more broad, but we can merge those. Yeah.
My question, sorry, answered it being no regards. My question was essentially that, but maybe we can elaborate a little more. Where did you get the psychological criteria from? Because there's a lot of disagreement in the literature on what gaming addiction is, or if it is. So was this the DSM-5, or was this the ICD-10?
So the definitions themselves, they're originally based on Mark Griffiths' 5-point criteria from his book in 1986, but they were since revised by Drummond and Sauer, so they refined it to, I believe, 4-point criteria. I believe one was a 4-point, one was a 5-point, but then essentially Drummond and Sauer kind of skipped Mark Griffiths' revision, so he actually revised it more recently, but they didn't pick that up, and so we kind of picked it up and drew influence from Drummond and Sauer as well.
Thanks. I just misspoke. It was Scandinavian nomination, but that's what I'm saying. Thanks.
So with Crypto Network, you have a lot of different servers, and there's been a lot of talk about like how much energy that consumes. And just looking into the future, do you think that that will have any influence on like the game development?
So ultimately because it's stored on the network, executing any code or getting that network to do anything becomes more expensive. And so the games that we looked at, so CryptoKitties as an example, the transaction cost associated with any game action, so like if you were to breed 2 kittens, I believe is around 10 cents. So with different network structures and sizes, we think that cost will vary. So ultimately there is some sort of cost in that.
So next we're going to move into a paper that looks at in-game purchasing in the online game Fortnite.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Jie. I'm a PhD student from New Jersey Institute of Technology, and this is my advisor, and also the second author of this paper. Our topic is why purchase, who purchases and why, explaining motivations for in-game purchases in the online survival game Fortnite. So before we talk about Fortnite, let's talk about the free-to-play business model and the in-game items. The business model of publishing a game for free and then making revenues from selling in-game items for revenue, known as free-to-play, is really popular now. So in many free-to-play business, in many free-to-play games, in-game items are often instrumental and can directly benefit the player's gameplay. For example, to enhance their certain skill or receive extra time to play the game or unlock some features. But some games also provide purely cosmetic items for purchasing, such as just changing the clothes that the avatar wears. So then Fortnite. Okay, Fortnite is a multiplayer online survival game, known as the Battle Royale game genre. So once the game starts, up to 100 players must compete with others to collect weapons, resources, and items for survival and compete with one another. So one of the core mechanics is to collect resources to build platforms and walls to either get a vantage point or hide from the enemy. So the last player or team would be the winner. So Fortnite is also free to download and install. Most of its revenue is from more purchases of its in-game currency called V-Bucks. So 1,000 V-Bucks is equal to like $10. We decided to do this study because Fortnite is considered one of the most successful games to generate revenues from selling in-game items now. And it should also be noted that while in-game purchasing is certainly not new, but Fortnite is unique because the items are purely cosmetic and do not give the player any advantages. So if you pay or do not pay, basically you can still play the game it's not like any issue. So we want to know what are the differences between spenders and non-spenders in Fortnite, and among those who do spend money, why do some spend more than others? So in particular, we focus on 3 research questions. The first one, what factors are associated with the likelihood of spending money in Fortnite? And second, what are the reasons for players to buy in-game items in Fortnite? And third, how do those factors and reasons influence the actual amount of money players spend in the game? So we go back to literature to identify factors. We just realized many papers talk about the social and individual factors. And some papers talk about like habits, but previous research has explored those factors, right, in different gaming contexts. So Fortnite representing like a new game genre and context. So we decided to explore it. We applied like a survey study, explore Fortnite, and tried to answer our research questions. So to recruit participants, we used multiple online and offline platforms, including like Mechanic Turk, and also Facebook group and Reddit, Twitter, and also like the esports club from our university. And we finally got 215 responses for the analysis. Because we're going to use like regression, so we try to explain our dependent and independent variable here. So the independent variables are the reasons to purchase in game were developed based on pilot interviews with Fortnite players. Also include habits and some other like behavioral questions like playing frequency, like how often do you play, how many times do you spend each week, and also demographic such as like age and income. We have like 2 dependent variables. The likelihood of purchasing games, which was measured by the question, do you buy game items in Fortnite? The answer is already yes or no. And also we have another dependent variable, the amount of V-Bucks we purchased. So the average age of our participants is around 29, so we have more male than female. Most of the participants are white. The primary platform they played was PC. And interesting, we found that most of the participants played a lot against strangers, and some of them they also play with their friends. So to answer our first research questions, so spenders versus non-spenders, we put both variables as dependent variable and ran regression. We found that age is negatively related to the likelihood of in-game purchasing, which means that younger people are more likely to buy in-game items. So in addition, while hours of play was not a significant predictor, but the total length of play is significant. So this finding suggests that it is an attachment to the game rather than the time spending in the game that affects players' willingness to pay. And we want to find out the motivations. Then we run factor analysis. We identify like 2 motivations for players to buy in-game items in Fortnite. Social pressure measures players' perception towards being influenced by friends or peers. And individuality measures participants' desire to be unique. So you can take a look at the items. And then among the spenders who spend more, we also run like a regression model, including those 2 motivations variables. And we found that habit is negatively related to actual purchasing behavior. So we don't know why. So a possible explanation is that players who spend more in the game are compulsive shoppers. So and care more about the cosmetic value rather than the instrumental value of the virtual goods. So individuality was positively, where social pressure was negatively related to the actual money spending. So in this sense, players who want to differentiate them from their friends and other players will spend more money in the game. So our finding point on some aspects that may have been overlooked in other studies, especially regarding digital consumption and self-expression. So in our study, digital consumption and the spending behavior is motivated by being unique from others rather than wanting to belong to the community. So in this sense, digital consumption is not for aggregating or co-constructing the self, but for establishing a more distinctive self. So since contextualization is an important factor of studying the virtual economy, so we thus believe that our work also point out the importance of taking the specific online context, like a survival genre, right, a survival game, and social dynamics, different type of collaborations, and the tendency to play with strangers into account when discussing digital consumption and self-expression. Social pressure, different from other social factors such as social rules and social interactions that has been explored in pre-literacy review. It is rarely explored in the gaming context, maybe the first time in Fortnite. So, and also we identify like a negative association between social pressure and actual money spending. So it's different from pre-literacy review, we don't know. So the future research can do like a qualitative study to give more like a better explanation to this relationship, right? And we also only focus on this one platform. So maybe future research can do like cross-platform and from other popular platforms such as Second Life and World of Warcraft. So I mean, this is like a preliminary study, so we found something that we cannot fully explain everything. So that's why we like do more. We hope like to do more so in the future. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. We're open now for questions. I see.
Hi, Jimmy Zoe from Epic Games. So I was wondering, a large population of Fortnite is children players, and there are some issues of like social pressure being applied on children who don't have skins compared to people who do have skins. And I'm wondering like how much of the population, what percentage of the participants are children? Do you notice any trends for social pressure on that point?
Okay, I didn't mention that when we design the survey, we have to prove it by the ARB, right? So we already said that the participants have to be higher than, have to be like like 18 or larger. So that's why you see like average is like 28 something, because we didn't include children in this study.
Can I ask why? Or
because we think there, if we try to do study with children, there's always like an ethical issue, and because this paper is a larger project with live streaming, and live streaming is also like for adults, so we just restrict the age to 18.
Okay, thank you.
Sam Roman, University of Canterbury, New Zealand. So my question is, did you specifically ask them if they spent money on skins, or did you ask them if they generally spent money on Fortnite, like Battle Pass or something like that, or did you distinguish between those two things?
So we just asked them, did you spend money on Fortnite, and how much do you buy for V-Bucks?
So it technically could be that they spent money on a Battle Pass, but they didn't spend money on a skin, and they would still be near side.
Okay, so even though it's for Battle Pass, you still have to get this like skin stuff, right? Just like virtual items, right? So basically the same thing.
Okay.
But it didn't differentiate. Yeah, that's kind of like a conversation.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, Andres Garcia from Caltech. Have you thought about like the framework from like the pay to win? Because all your paying is for aesthetic experiences. Have you thought about maybe like how it works in the pay to win framework?
Sorry, I didn't hear clearly.
Sorry, so pay to win is basically you get actual enhancements to the mechanics of your gameplay. The aesthetics ones are just aesthetic, so it's more social amount. Have you investigated the side more like the pay to win framework in your study?
So do you mean, so I hear you mention like gambling mechanics or something? So pay to win, what do you mean like?
Okay, there's games where if you buy things, you get more activity, yeah, your gun shoots better, or you can run faster, or so you actually change the game mechanics through this payment. Yeah, I'll explain it to you later.
All right. So Fortnite, the in-game items are not gonna give you like the advantages like you improve your speed or something, right? So in Fortnite is purely cosmetic. It will only change like your appearance or something like that. So that's why it's very interesting because people gonna buy something that will not, build like advantages from others, but they still buy it. That's why we do this study. Yeah.
Thank you. Next up, we have the surrogate body in play.
My name is Katja Spiel, and my pronouns are they, them. I'm with KU Leuven and the University of Vienna, and I'm actually really excited to discuss this work that I did. And in the last part, also the caption getting like media theory and play, and specifically how the surrogate body theory from immersion theory in cinema translates to game contexts. And I'm really sorry, but I kind of also want to break the format. It took me 5 years to get to those thoughts. Maybe I'm also just slow, but like I feel it profits more from an interactive thing. So if you have a question, ask it right away. The talk fits its moment at the time that it has. That also for me, we have to be a little tentative, but it's going to be fine. So the surrogate body theory comes from media studies and particularly, as I said, film studies, and Christiane Voss developed it to understand cultural and mediated immersion in movies, particularly the cinema. And, well, distilled into one quite long sentence, the theory says that immersion happens when a viewer lends their affective and emotional responses to the film by embodying them, leading to a metaphorical body that is made up of the intersubjective interplay between viewers and film, and then facilitated through a physical aesthetic distance. It's super complex. But I went like literally to the drawing board and I tried to figure out what this means. Like, where is that surrogate body? What do people do? What is that distance? And as you can see here, they don't do a lot in cinema. The affective response, I mean, it can be outward when you feel something that you feel through the movie, but the screen is really far away, or like, and it has to bridge this large distance, and the embodied reactions are also really limited. It's similar to here, you have like this constrained space, and also there are like not just the chair and the seating options, but there are also social expectations from viewers. I mean, everybody has been in cinema. So there's like limits of how much you can express your emotional response. But it's not the same for every context. This context is a little different, although it has like parallels to cinema. And here we have a giant picture of Catherine that I promised months ago on Twitter, presenting a paper remotely at a conference. And yeah, the dispositive is like the context is pretty cinematic, but the interaction differs. People can exert some control of what happens on the screen by asking questions. And games put that further, don't they? Like,
So Christiane Voss is the main person behind the theory, and she's at the University of Weimar, where I studied before, and like a while ago. And for the last 5 years, I've been quite angry actually about one particular footnote of that theory development, in which she claims that games and digital media to be like essentially equivalent to cinematic dispositives. And I was like, really? So let's talk about what this means for like a very stereotypical gamer image context at a personal computer side. And we still have a screen, multiple in this case. But suddenly the surrogate body is located and expressed through 2 positions on the player. It not only lends affective response and emotional response, players also lend their actions to the game. So given that this tends to be an, well, at least physically, often solitary and private activity, emotional responses are not as regulated as well as in social contexts like the cinema. And they can technically be more expressive, but that has consequences for gameplay. If you like stand up and like are like yelling or something, you do not have your hands on the controller anymore, and that has consequences for that interaction. So players not only lend emotions, they also lend actions. And that is different in other types of games. Like here we have a Wii or a Kinect, and in the Wii case you still have a controller in hand, and the Kinect not necessarily. But suddenly your entire body is a mirror image of the surrogate body. It is fully lent to that context, and any action you do might have consequences. Like, as long as you keep your hands there, if you play on a desktop computer, you can still be like, wow. But if you do that in like a game that like looks at you back, so to speak, that has consequences then as well. So emotional responses, and we didn't even go that far, but like emotional responses also become actions that are lent to the game and to that surrogate body. So yeah, and that also means that displays of affect suddenly can also become like not just like the immersive experience, but also fundamentally points of disruption. I mean, I'm there for disruption, but I'm also pointing that. And it also has implications for ways of knowing in games. The more associated certain contexts are with things we could feasibly also do outside of games or outside of digital games, this becomes like a way of engaging with embodied knowledge. Like here the player can draw from an experience of fishing in carnival games, while also practicing this action for potentially different non-digital contexts, but in this case, I kind of like a poster, because that's my job. So the embodied experiences of players play an additional role in how they lend their body and their actions to the surrogate body. I warned you it's a lot. And then we call this embodied play, and I'm going to trouble that in a second, but if we look at embodied play, where you lend your entire body even more to that surrogate body and to the game environment and are determined by that game environment and how you act and how you move and how you are with the game, as you see here in head-mounted VR to the left. Or even like you might even suspend some sensory perceptions in that context. And like the sensory perceptions of the physical environment become overridden by like the game environment. Like when you see, for example, but also like by holding these controllers, there's some haptic feedback that isn't there, that isn't available to the physical environment. So basically with my starting point of being annoyed that games were described as fundamentally the same to cinema, and troubling that and being like, yeah, no, that is much more complex. Because you lend actions to the surrogate body as well as affect. And that these contexts and in-games are also hugely diverse across different play scenarios. Which we then also can understand as embodied. It becomes more, like every play experience then becomes more fully embodied, and that like is what I mean with when we say we have embodied play and non-embodied play, but if we take this theory, every play act becomes embodied. So bringing this into play didn't just mean we were able to like extend that theory, but it also helped us understand more about what it means to have a body and play. And the paper goes deeper and has a fancy table. And hopefully helpfully more on background theory and is just tremendously more nuanced. But let me say more nuanced. There is more work to do, and I'm totally happy to talk with people about that. While I was preparing the talk, I was asked whether I'm drawing my presentation, and my answer was just no, I drew my paper, because you find all of these figures in the paper as well. Besides making the point that I just made, like with theories and with like lending affect, but also lending embodied actions to a given game context, we're also trying to make a point about knowing beyond textual engagements, but knowing through drawing. Because I started seriously engaging with that at the point where I was able to understand the cinema theory in a way that I could draw on it and then develop and iterate over certain contexts. So I'm also arguing for a methodological diversity in terms of like engaging with very different ways of knowledge construction. But if you're interested in more of my textual work, it's just like in 15 minutes. And then we'll talk about that in epidocy. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. I really think it's great that that kind of more critical theories are represented. I find it just really exciting. Do we have any questions from the audience? I think it's a long chat left. Yes. Daniel Wild, University of Southern Denmark. Kata, thank you. I don't know, you might hate me for this question, but I want to ask what you think the people in this room and in this community who make games and interrogate the act of making games as they're making them and through making them, what they can take away from this in their actual making and doing an embodied engagement with the construction of games and the researching, the act of researching, embodied act of researching them.
So we do have some guidelines, but the main takeaway that I would like to see is that people think more about the embodiment of the context, because right now, on the one hand in design, it seems a little bit opportunistic in terms of like, what is that new technology and what kind of like, let's just do another Switch game and like put the Goose Game on Switch, even though it might not necessarily be the experience that they want from an embodied perspective. Like it's a lens shifting in how you also try to like acknowledge the sorry, I talk like that. Acknowledge the technological positions.